We're going to cover several things today, starting with the background and goals for the project that we undertook last year. I'd like to tell a little bit about the primary findings. We actually have 7 in that area. We'll then move on to market intelligence. There were a couple of requests actually in the walk-up, the comments and the registrations for the webinar for such information, and we're glad to be able to present it today. Then we're going to talk about options for international rights. There are a couple of questions related to the use of digital asset distributors, or DADs, as well as concurrent release of print and ebooks. And we'll try to get to those either as part of the presentation or certainly in the questions afterwards. And finally, we're going to close with the 12 recommendations that we offered for Livre Canada Books and for Canadian publishers. One of them is fundamental, I think. One's counterintuitive, and one I think is helpful but often overlooked. In that section, we'll also try to address the use of DRM, as well as what business models might make sense for Canadian publishers who are looking to increase the success in exporting digital books. Start with a little bit about Livre Canada Books. As you probably know, it's dedicated to developing and increasing Canadian publishers' sales in international markets. Part of its charter is to provide market intelligence as well as financial, promotional, and logistical support. Livre Canada Books recognizes that new technologies, particularly with respect to digital books, are changing how publishers have to think about creating, managing, and disseminating digital content. And this means that the established, which are often arm's length models, are giving way to more complex decisions about what publishers should do to maintain, sell, or license rights for digital content. These decisions are complicated by different penetration and growth rates for e-reading in various markets, as well as a mix of formats and devices across those markets. And although there have been some movement toward what we would consider e-reading standards, the industry is just getting started, and there are aggregators and retailers that are using proprietary formats to lock in customers and to grow market share. But at the same time, growth in digital distribution is pushing publishers in Canada and elsewhere to launch titles globally or risk that unmet demand, books not being available, will be fulfilled with pirated content. That would happen in countries where digital versions of books are not yet available. We see that windows for worldwide release may be growing shorter, and that's a trend that would make the complexity of digital workflows a potential impediment. If it takes a lot longer to get an ebook out, you can miss a window for potential sales. For all of these reasons, Livre Canada Books asked us to develop a research paper and related data that could provide Canadian publishers with information that they need to compete and grow in this digital marketplace. Although the research that we've done focuses on markets where export sales of print books have traditionally been strong for Canadian publishers, that would be the United States, the United Kingdom, and France in particular, it also provides some actionable guidance beyond those markets. The best practices guide that Nicolas mentioned a few minutes ago was written to address 4 primary objectives. The first was to provide Canadian publishers with market intelligence on the digitally but robust export markets that have been traditionally strong. And for both traditional and emerging markets, we compiled information about things like formats, standards, devices, and operating systems, and we'll talk about that in today's talk. The second is to evaluate options that Canadian publishers should consider to maintain, sell, or license digital sales rights outside of Canada. The third was to recommend a strategy with respect to digital formats and rights that can help Canadian publishers maximize digital income, which we defined as revenues less the cost of being ready for digital export markets. And then the final piece, which we will not cover today, but is available in the paper itself, is to provide an annex of resources that you could use to stay current as digital content markets evolve. So we found 7 primary findings, 4 in the area of content and 3 in the area of technologies. With respect to content, the success of Amazon's Kindle, which you're quite familiar with, I'm sure, and its competitors has made the United States the world's largest e-book market. At the time of the initial research in 2010, between 7 and 8% of trade books were sold in a digital format, and this share is generally understood to have doubled in 2011. The second is that demand for ebooks in both core and emerging markets is expected to grow rapidly. Between 2011 and 2013, compounded annual growth rates for ebook sales in the United States, the United Kingdom, and France the markets of greatest interest for Canadian publishers, are projected to grow between 41% and 51% a year. At these growth rates, this means that the number of ebooks sold will double every 18 to 24 months across all core markets. Third, opportunities in emerging markets, the ones other than the US, UK, and France, almost certainly exist for publishers who can work with partners, that is, device manufacturers, content aggregators, and in some cases local or regional publishers. In Europe, the available data points to longer-term opportunities include Australia and India. And the final piece on the content side is that growth in supply and demand for ebooks is challenging traditional models for regional rights sales. Aggregators like Kobo, Google, Apple, and increasingly Amazon can distribute digital content internationally. This provides opportunities for publishers to distribute content cost-effectively to multiple markets. Publishers who relied on local partners may need to develop new schemes for rights. With respect to technologies, it's fairly clear that content forms are evolving. Across many markets, in fact, even today, the dominant form of digital content has been the PDF. In the US market, however, Kindle format titles now match the share of ebooks read as PDF. And recent updates to EPUB, which is the open ebook standard, are expected to strengthen its share as a format as well. The second piece that complicates things for publishers looking to compete in the digital space is that the market is served by both dedicated e-readers, these would be devices like the Kindle, Nook, Kobo, and others, as well as multifunction devices. The latter ranges from smartphones, the iPhone and various Android devices, to tablets, most notably the iPad, although there are many newer competitors now. The increasing number and complexity of ebook reading platforms is a challenge that any publisher that's looking to deliver digital content has to be able to address. And then finally, sales of tablets like the iPad and Samsung's Galaxy may take share away from multifunction smartphones. And although the tablets offered to date, actually Samsung is about to introduce a tablet that would make this untrue, do not offer wireless cell phone coverage, they can support voice over internet protocols using 3G and Wi-Fi connections, and their functionality is expected to improve. Tablets offer publishers a better reading experience than smartphones, but they also offer many other distractions for potential ebook consumers, potentially threatening the likelihood of getting somebody to read on a digital platform. Now, the report that we wrote and the talk that I'm giving today tackles developments and trends in 5 different segments. The first is worldwide. Then we'll talk about the US, which is the largest market, the UK, France, and then new and emerging markets. And I'll take each of these in turn. Worldwide, we go back to 2010. Outsell estimated that year that the worldwide ebook market totaled about $4.6 billion. Education titles actually were the highest, $1.8 billion, often as PDF. And then consumer and trade books followed with $1.5 billion in sales, and then professional publications. Outsell at that time also reported that the $4.6 billion in ebook sales was seen largely in the US market, but they thought that rapid growth was expected to take place in several major markets between 2011 and 2015. In fact, the total market for digital books could grow to as much as $18.2 billion or more by 2013. At that volume, 18 billion, digital books would make up about 20% of the total sold worldwide that year. In a recent comparable analysis, Barclays Capital estimated that a quarter of worldwide sales could come from digital books as early as 2015. Because the markets for educational and professional content are somewhat less visible, the expansion of digital sales in those segments has not garnered the attention that followed the growth in trade sales of digital books. The share of digital sales in those markets is more than double the trade number, although the substantial room to grow is evident across all segments, meaning that in professional and education publishing, you've got double-digit share of market, but they're smaller markets. PricewaterhouseCoopers, a consulting firm, reported that ebooks are already well established across special interest markets. particularly in the US and the UK. Citing the UK-based Publishers Association, PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, claims that the English special interest in scientific publishers generated 130 million euros in digital sales in 2009, a figure that PwC, even at that time, felt may be understating the total due to the way the discount methodology is taken care of. Finally, our research uncovered 4 pan-market issues that, while not specifically worldwide in nature, appear to impact all publishers and markets to some degrees. These issues included, first, the digital book value chain and its evolving roles, that the traditional relationship between publishers, wholesalers, retailers is shifting as digital comes into the marketplace. The second was a set of workflow issues, particularly how to manage and support ebooks. The impact of that, value-added tax policies on ebooks, particularly in Europe, where ebooks are typically taxed at a much higher rate than print books, at least for the moment. And finally, the assessment of the impact of piracy on digital content sales. There's some detail on each of these topics in the final report, and we can come back to the topics in answering questions if doing so is of value. The explosive growth in the popularity of trade ebooks has helped spur discussion about what makes a market ready for digital books. In a survey of leading publishers, intermediaries, online stores, device manufacturers, as well as a telecommunications company, PwC identified several success factors that can be helpful in determining the viability of emerging markets, as well as content verticals. The things that made a market successful or potentially successful included having affordable, attractive e-reading devices available, having a wide range of content available for those devices, a generally perceived price competitiveness on the part of ebooks relative to their print counterparts, and generally easy interfaces. Closed systems like the Kindle might be okay, but those that are seen as difficult to use, and I think many times people think about the original Sony devices, are not. On the other side, some of the most significant impediments to ebook adoption included not having enough content in the local stores, overpriced devices, and compatibility and interoperability issues. And this sometimes includes the impact of DRM. Shifting our attention to the United States, nearly half of all the books that are sold online or through a large chain bookstore, and the early and wide success of online retailing in this market has helped make the introduction growth of the Kindle possible. And it continues to support what has been, at least until this year, significant year-over-year increases in book sales, ebook sales. In the last 3 years, the number of titles commercially available in digital form in the United States has grown significantly. Today, most distributors claim they hold between 500,000 and 750,000 digital titles in stock, while Google eBooks, whose archives include both commercial and public domain titles, launched with what they claim to be 3 million ebooks. As the number of ebook titles has grown, so too have the number of options for distributing content. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and Google support distribution all the way through to the consumer, although Kobo has also developed some white label solutions that are otherwise branded. Ingram Digital, Zebra Digital, and Overdrive are business-to-business suppliers that focus on various channels, Overdrive, for example, with libraries, sometimes acting as white label hosts for publishers and other retailers. Digital content stores can be horizontal. You would think about Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Kobo as examples. They can be vertical, CourseSmart, and education publishers one, or niche, and then you have independents like Diesel, Books on Board, and ScrollMotion. In the last 2 years, some file sharing sites, essentially what people sometimes thought about as pirate sites, these included Wattpad and Scribd, have also entered digital storefront space. When Apple entered the U.S. book market in 2010, it gave publishers control over pricing as part of an agreement to serve as their agent when selling ebooks. The so-called agency model that you're probably very familiar with was initially adopted by 5 of the 6 largest publishers in the U.S. market. Random House did not reach an agreement with Apple until early in 2011. Some state attorneys generals in the United States have expressed concern about what they feel is an anti-competitive practice implied by agency pricing, although to date no firm actions have been taken. At the time it was introduced, the agency model was hailed by some publishers as an opportunity to exert control over ebook pricing and reduce the risk of less expensive ebooks cannibalizing sales of physical formats. After some initial resistance and a public fight with Macmillan, Amazon agreed to offer agency terms to several of the largest publishers. This is specifically for ebooks, but to date the retailer has not extended that model to most other publishers. As a result, most distributors and all stores are required to manage an ebook business in which the terms of trade vary by publisher. Ebook stores deliver content to a wide range of devices and platforms, and this is actually starts to get at the question of, do you need a retailer if you have a DAD? To date, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Kobo have introduced their own devices, and they also offer reader software that supports content consumption across multiple devices. Sony has been said for some time to be developing such a feature, but it lacks a robust storefront, so the value of it is not quite clear yet. Apple has its own platform extended earlier this in the last several months, powered by the iBookstore and running on Apple's iOS devices, which include the iPad, the iPod, and its companion, the iPod Touch. Reflecting the parent company's hardware focus, Apple has not added iBookstore apps on other devices. The current store offers a fraction of the number of titles available through other services, although these situations are also quite fluid. Vertical stores can address niches that include education. CourseSmart is an example. In early 2011, a number of startups and consortia announced plans to target the library market for university press titles. These new entrants included JSTOR, Project Muse, and Oxford University Press, which was acting as a distributor of record. The rise of what are effectively vertical stores for digital content is an attempt, at least, to improve the visibility of a range of titles in what can be really seen as a hyper-crowded marketplace in the United States. In 2009, the latest year for which figures are fully available, the U.S. market saw 250,000 new titles released by traditional publishers, with nearly 3 times that number introduced by non-traditional means, including self-publishing and harvesting public domain content. The huge number of new titles is one of the reasons that any publisher looking to enter the U.S. market must think carefully about making their book content easily discoverable through search engines and other means. Now, in the UK market, independent bookstores retain a significant share of retail distribution. Online sales are relatively undeveloped, and that's a contributing factor in the modest penetration to date for ebooks. Growth in ebook sales over the next 5 years is expected to alter the current market profile substantially. With English language digital content increasingly available in the United Kingdom, the countrywide launch of the Kindle has jump-started ebook sales. Estimates vary, but in 2010, ebooks were thought to have captured between 1.5% to 3% of the market. That would put the UK a couple of years behind the US in market share for ebooks. Supporting this trend, PwC reported that UK bookstore Waterstones began offering the Sony Reader in fall 2008, even without a store, and it has since sold 60,000 readers. In terms of the market, the UK-based industry publication, The Bookseller, has twice surveyed the publishing community about a range of issues related to the creation, sale, and consumption of digital content. Of those responding to the more recent Bookseller surveys, almost 80% had read a book digitally. And an encouraging sign, 47% had paid for an ebook in 2009, a number that nearly doubled in 2010. Despite the significant growth in ebook consumption, only a third of the publishers responding to the Bookseller survey felt that they were well positioned digitally. This same group sees the likely winners not being publishers, but rather Amazon, Google, and Apple, which is a far cry from the traditional market leaders for our industry. 2/3 of those reporting felt that ebooks are growing the size of the total market, but perhaps at a cost. Half of the responding to the survey said that agreed that ebooks are shaking up publishers' standard order of territorial rights. Only a fifth said no, that was not the case, responding that local knowledge about local markets trumps global reach. In a country that regularly buys and sells English language rights, the impact of changes in the nature of territorial rights would be significant for Canadian publishers. As in the United States, discussions of the royalty rates for ebooks are not settled. According to the bookseller, 35% of those responding said that they paid 15% or less on ebooks. 11% said they paid between 16 and 20%, while a quarter offered royalty rates between 21 and 25%. With the relative share of digital content and the average price paid still in significant flux, this part of the business model is likely to continue to evolve. PwC noted that in the UK, new ebook titles are available for generally the equivalent of US $12 to US $14. Here, recommended retail prices were eliminated in 1995, allowing price competition among retailers. This arrangement may have helped actually spur the early adoption of agency pricing in the UK. In each of the last 3 years, the booksellers released the results of its studies, and they note that the support for the overall publisher support for agency is mixed. Perhaps most telling, only 10% of those surveyed thought that the agency model would last for more than this decade. A third of those responding thought it would never be properly adopted. The survey noted that concerns about the impact of piracy were significant. They actually, drawing their words, claiming that piracy is a major threat, the bookseller found that 55% of those responding have experienced some piracy. Almost 60% have a strategy in place to address it, largely takedown orders or enforcement. In distributing digital books, there's an opportunity, though, I think, for publishers to distinguish between the impact of piracy, which is lost sales, and its instant, which is the presence of digital content on file sharing sites. In the UK, Amazon dominates digital sales much as it does in the United States, with an estimated 61% share. Competitors include iTunes before the advent of the iBookstore, which had a 23% share in 2010. Direct sales from publishers' website with about an 18% share. The iBookstore after it launched, and then bookseller Waterstones, which had about 12%. As in the United States and likely France, a digital book strategy that excludes Amazon likely reduces the potential market that you have for any trade or other types of books. Among those already reading ebooks in the UK, the most common device, 61% with multiple answers allowed, is actually a personal computer, a desktop or laptop. This parallels the state of the US market in 2008. About 45% of those who read ebooks do so on a dedicated reader. A third use a mobile device to provide some other functionality, while a fifth are already reading on a tablet. The share taken up by tablet reading at the time of the survey is significant because it was a very short period between the time that those devices were available and the survey took place. Switching our attention to France, in this market, chains and supermarkets provide nearly half of the retail distribution for the books sold in France. Online sales come in third. Although the country legally restricts price competition, independent stores play only a small role here. The somewhat more active online sales channel suggests that ebook growth would be well supported here, although it remains unclear how France will view any discounts offered for digital books. In 2009, title production in France, that is new publications, not imports, grew the most in school textbooks, games and activities, fantasy and science fiction, philosophy, cooking, and health. Double-digit declines in title production were seen in things like leisure, business management, sports, mind, body, spirit, and theater. The ebook market in France is just developing, with the share of sales claimed by digital content thought to be as low as 2%. Just as an aside, the charts that I showed earlier for the US and the UK actually are, they have a different scale on them. So although this looks for France like it's going to be growing significantly in the next few years, and it will relative to its base, I'll show a chart at the end that puts everything on the same scale, and you'll see the relative growth for both the US, UK, and France, as well as other markets. In France, the ebook publishing there have been 3 ebook publishing platforms set up. Numalog, set up by Hachette Livre, Edenlivre, which is a three-way joint venture, and ePlatform, a two-way venture. And there's an incentive among French publishers to own their own distribution platform. There's also a concern that ebook growth may be limited if retailers must connect to multiple competing platforms to be able to offer titles from a complete set of French publishers. In that regard, the fall 2010 announcements of new e-readers from Fnac, as well as the Oyo, may be breakthrough developments. As many as 40,000 Fnac devices may have been sold in France in a 3-month period at the start of 2011. Of particular interest to publishers, both in France and those looking to sell book content in France, is the uniform pricing rule. By law, each printed book has to be sold at the same price, with few exceptions outside of regulated sales periods. The law dates back 30 years when it was put in place to protect traditional bookstores competing with larger chains. A similar rule for ebooks was adopted in February 2011. One observer noted many publishers were waiting for this law before going to digital very strongly because, from their point of view, it's very important for them to control the price. Although ebooks may just be taking hold in France, awareness is healthy and may be growing. A survey conducted by Ipsos indicated that almost half of those surveyed had heard of digital books. About 14% are interested in ebooks, and 5% have already read one. As was the case in a comparable UK study, the main device to read digital books was the computer, desktop, or laptop. E-readers have been said to lag, coming in 7th among devices. And at the time of the survey, only about 1/4 of those responding said they were using an e-reader to consume digital content. Early interest in ebooks is strongest in categories that include science fiction and fantasy, how-to manuals, crime fiction, and dictionaries. French language publishers whose publishing programs are strong in one or more of these genres may find early success possible, even if in France overall ebook sales lag. Another encouraging note, there's a survey that found that the most frequent book buyers in France are between the ages of 25 and 44, a demographic segment that also is more likely to own and use one or more mobile devices. Within this age segment, 16% buy a book a month or more. By way of comparison in France, 62% of those over the age of 65 bought no books at all. Younger readers do appear more aware of ebook options. The 2009 Ipsos study found that 79% of those between the ages of 18 and 30 had read at least one book in the prior year, a third read every day. Nearly half had heard of ebooks, 20% had read one. If 2011 and 2012 do become the inflection years for consumption of digital books in France, it's likely that this younger cohort will play a leading role. Digital book consumption in at least 3 other European markets is expected to grow significantly between 2011 and 2015. Ranked in order of expected digital share, these markets include Spain, Germany, and Netherlands. All 3 countries were named in the survey of Canadian publishers conducted in concert with this study, but they failed to crack the top 10 markets for English language publishers who responded. And only Germany made the top 10 markets of interest for French language respondents. This discrepancy suggests that outside of the core markets, which are the US, the UK for English language publishers, and France and the US for French language publishers, growth in ebook sales may require Canadian publishers to place greater emphasis in emerging markets. This focus could involve one or more of several strategies, which we'll talk about after the break. 2 other markets, India and Australia, may also offer opportunities for Canadian publishers, although data for these markets is largely anecdotal at this point. Australia, in particular, was ranked 3rd among markets of interest for Canadian publishers who responded to the survey. With both Kobo and Apple increasingly active in the Australian market, the next few years may provide ebook sales opportunities for publishers in a position to add their digital content to these or other distribution platforms. We've been spending the first part of this presentation talking about both the background as well as profiles of traditional and emerging markets for digital books. What I want to do here is switch gears a bit and start talking about options to maintain, sell, or license rights. We'll also get into some detail on the recommendations that we made for Canadian publishers as a result of the research that we did last year. Now, with respect to ebook sales, they're expected to increase 40% or more in each year in most markets. This means that Canadian publishers would be well served to think about three aspects of their efforts to maintain, sell, or ebook rights. And to help guide them, we looked at what publishers can do now to capitalize on ebook growth, business models that might affect future export sales, and then steps that you can take to improve overall digital readiness. That said, the available options include selling digital rights by territory, which is an extension of the existing model, retaining digital rights and selling through an international or local aggregator, or both, and finally retaining digital rights and then selling directly. And we'll consider each of these options in turn. Business models affecting ebook acquisition, sales, and distribution really continue to evolve, and any assessment of your options should be tested frequently. We recommend quarterly to semi-annual to at least step back and say what's really going on in the marketplace. These assessments also need to be performed on a market-by-market basis. What works in the United States could present challenges in France or an emerging market, and there's no easy way to predict that given the current fluid state of all of the markets for digital books. Now, we'll start with selling rights by territory or by language. I think most publishers are familiar with the export model that sells rights to a trusted partner, hopefully a trusted partner, in an international market, typically a country or region. In some cases, the partner may acquire reproduction rights more broadly, for example, English language rights outside of North America. But the principle is the same. You divide the world into distinct markets and sell and mix with partners the right to represent the work locally. Now, following a series of disputes about ebook rights and their ownership, most publishers are trying to essentially explicitly acquire ebook rights as specific rights associated with the new work. This works well within Canada, where a print book and a digital companion can be prepared and released simultaneously. But the growth of a global market for digital content is placing pressure on this model, largely because it takes time to negotiate territorial agreements for physical products. During the time it takes to negotiate a territorial agreement, for example, the digital ebook version sold in Canada can be found on commercial sites with controls in place to prevent someone in another region from ordering the digital book that they want. That's good news in that you're preserving the sales for that market, but this increased visibility online can frustrate demand and increase the likelihood of legitimate sales being lost to piracy. In addition, selling rights to distribute physical books may not make sense when the demand in an underlying market is small. The English language market in the Netherlands, for example, may not support physical production of a wide variety of Canadian titles, but it could be a valuable source of some digital sales. Selling digital rights as part of a fixed package may limit opportunities to grow overall digital revenues. Still, some Canadian publishers may want to maintain their current approach while exploring the implications of ebook sales in markets that they understand and in which they can identify trusted partners. In these cases, we think that publishers would do well to do three things. The first is conclude negotiations on a more timely basis, ideally coincident with the publication in the home market, to reduce the likelihood of demand lost to pirated versions of digital sales. The second is to partner with publishers that can offer broader ebook distribution agreements, avoiding where possible platforms that are publisher specific. And then the final thing is to consider rights agreements to test doing ebook only offerings in markets where physical sales have traditionally proven too small to support using physical copies. We think that publishers that are committed to maintaining a digital version of the traditional territorial model, though, may find themselves challenged over time. In core markets, at least, publishers who choose this path have to solicit information about trends in rights sales to see and to react to any developments. Second option that we thought is to sell digital and print rights separately. In this instance, you would sell ebooks to an international or a local aggregator. In markets in which a publisher has traditionally had some success selling physical inventory, separating the physical and digital rights may affect the willingness of the local partners to buy and promote the physical title. To avoid this particular conflict, publishers that are looking to test separate ebook sales may at least initially favor titles that otherwise would not have been picked up in a given market. Multinational aggregators like Kobo, the Apple iBook Store, and the Google eBook platform are at least one option for this. And although Amazon and Barnes & Noble operate robust ebook sales platforms, they're just getting started outside the US and the UK. Even multinational options have some limits to the markets they support, and it's a consideration that has to be addressed on a market-by-market basis. The nice thing about local aggregators, particularly for digital ebooks, is that they offer Canadian publishers a degree of market knowledge that multinational firms can sometimes have some trouble providing. Access to digital content may have reduced the absolute advantage of local market knowledge, but for at least some titles, it can provide a real advantage. On the other hand, Amazon and Kobo have worked to make their service available on a wide range of devices and platforms. And while Google and Kobo have actively partnered with local entities, including publishers and booksellers, to establish their services in local markets, this makes them potentially appealing for, depending on the markets you want to reach and the type of books that you sell. So this is platform interdependence that makes it difficult to offer an absolute recommendation here. Whether you're partnering with a multinational or a local aggregator in international markets, you should still seek agents who can offer broader ebook distribution agreements. Markets like France, where the platforms, at least to date, have still been publisher-specific, may limit both consumer acceptance and market opportunities for Canadian ebook sales. Finally, there's the option of retaining digital rights and selling directly. There's some appeal to direct sales of digital books. Margins are better even compared with agency pricing, and the publisher retains direct control over pricing, even in markets where discounting is allowed. Direct contact with those purchasing titles can provide publishers with customer data that would otherwise be unavailable. For certain types of books, unique reference works, for example, or well-known industry data sources of undisputed value, it's possible to move past issues of discoverability and access to sell directly. A significant share of titles, however, is not well known and would require significant publisher effort to build enough sales volume to justify direct sales. The lessons learned from Amazon's success apply here. Readers value extensive content libraries that can be accessed easily on platforms that enable one-stop shopping. Few Canadian publishers could offer a content library extensive enough to draw traffic and sales. This argues really against an over-reliance on direct sales. Certainly, publishers can gain valuable experience selling digital books directly, and for markets in which local partners are not interested or unavailable, direct sales may be a credible option. On the other hand, aggregators, Kobo in particular, are already operating in hundreds of markets that have limited local demand but potentially significant total demand. So in the near term, a direct strategy may be best combined with an agreement with at least one well-placed international partner. A second parallel option may be to gather with other Canadian publishers in a consortium, such as the Association of Canadian Publishers is doing with its creation of eBound Canada. A consortium can provide value in a variety of ways. It can help negotiate partnerships with online retailers, generate sales of Canadian ebooks, license digital rights, and when needed, provide digitization support for member publishers. Where specific content types, genres, for example, romance novels, are made richer, the consortium may provide value, but if it fails to deliver adequate content depth, the overhead required to create and run such a joint venture may begin to outweigh its benefits. These aren't the only models. There are some that are emerging at this point. Ebooks to date have really retained a product focus. The format is digital, but the end result remains the sale of a specific content object. Some aspects of the digital book have started to challenge that model. Use of digital rights management schemes, for example, makes it harder to lend or even to read a particular book outside of a given content platform. Both Amazon and Barnes & Noble offer only limited options to lend a title, and some people have observed that digital book buyers are really purchasing a right to read a specific title on a given platform, not a book itself. The market has changed somewhat in the last year or so. Lending options have been introduced. Some aggregators have responded with book lending features that publishers can elect to support, though not all do. It's not clear whether the inability to share digital books is one of the reasons that the average price of digital books is lower than print, but it's certainly true that at lower price points, publishers are reluctant to expand lending options. The shift in consumption has given rise to a discussion of new models that include digital content subscriptions with a fixed or periodic fee for access, as well as pay-as-you-go or pay-as-you-read models that resemble what is now commonly used for periodicals. In the trade market, these options are not yet well articulated, although digital-first imprints like Harlequin's Carina Press might serve as a genre-specific application. In education and professional markets, some publishers have collaborated to create consortia with a vertical content focus. The strongest example may be CourseSmart, which I mentioned earlier. Phil Bain Group described CourseSmart as an integrated digital publishing platform focused on an audience. Higher education faculty can recombine content from multiple texts. CourseSmart provides a marketplace in which students can buy the resulting e-textbooks. This approach supports business models of several partners, which include, in the case of CourseSmart, Pearson, Cengage, McGraw-Hill Education, Wiley, F.A. Davis, and Bedford Freeman Worth Publishing Group. Canadian publishers may benefit by partnering with aggregators that can support so-called content verticals, collections of titles that match a reader's interests. These can be popular genres like romance novels, as well as any genre whose content is chunkable, that is, titles with discrete components that could be extracted and successfully recombined with other components. These types of titles might benefit from access to a platform like CourseSmart or Safari Online, which is O'Reilly Media's subscription-driven content service that offers content from titles published by O'Reilly, Pearson, Microsoft, and others. Further out, changes in the library market may open up richer and somewhat less institutional approaches to the acquisition of digital content. Pressured by shrinking revenues for local governments, some U.S. libraries have begun talking about patron-driven acquisition, as well as alternate models that could include one-time rentals and content leasing. The emerging role of libraries is an ongoing story that may ultimately affect how digital books are priced and distributed. And if you follow the U.S. market in particular, it's been a fairly contentious discussion. In terms of getting ready for new digital models, whatever they might be, there are a few things that I think are really important for Canadian publishers to get their arms around. The first is rights. I mean, you really have to know that your rights are well tracked and up to date, especially if you're trying to put books in a variety of markets where they've either never been practical to sell as physical objects or never even been considered. You want to make sure that you have a clear understanding that you have the right to do so. The second is, because we're working on digital files that often have been either edited or updated at the printer, it's critical that you know where your files are. The ideal answer is in-house. That's not always the case with many publishers, and that's not unique to Canadian publishers. However, if you want to be able to provide a digital file for a particular partner, aggregator, or even directly from your own website, you have to know where it is, and you want to make sure that it's the current version. The third, where you're using aggregators and trading partners, is to align your metadata with partner requirements. It's a not quite hidden secret, but it's not always well known that most of the intermediaries have a different expectations for what metadata you provide them. Trying to get ready for that is critical because otherwise you wind up throwing a lot of effort to creating a custom feed for each of the partners. I mentioned before things like the components or chunks that are sold by entities like O'Reilly and CourseSmart. But if you really want to sell components of your content, you have to plan ahead. It's not that you can create a single product, a book, and then go about chunking it. That's probably too expensive. You really want to be thinking of from the time that you conceive of and develop a book project. And the final piece, as you've heard me say about with respect to availability and the threat of piracy, is to think globally. As soon as you publish a book, particularly even a print book, but certainly a print plus a digital combination for a book in Canada, it's visible everywhere in the world. That's going to raise expectations for the consumers who would like to be able to acquire that book. but it's also going to put pressure on you as a publisher to have to be able to meet the market demand much more quickly than you've been able to do in the past with territorial agreements. So we wanted to come up with some recommendations, and we had actually in 3 different areas. The first is getting started, the second was going global, and the third is conducting some internal assessments for your books. With respect to getting started, there are 3. A wide range of Canadian publishers currently export print and at least some digital content, and that was confirmed in our study. And while these recommendations don't always apply universally, they represent actions that we think can help you improve your ability to sell digital content outside of Canada. First and foremost, EPUB. It is emerging as a robust open standard. The current version is EPUB 3. And publishers that are looking to grow their ebook business should adapt workflows to support seamless EPUB output, or at least partner with a conversion vendor that can provide EPUB for them. Second is that the near-term focus for most publishers remain ebooks that are generally faithful reproductions of their print counterparts. The range of various e-reading devices means that publishers will need to take into account formats that can be portrait or landscape depending on the reader's preferences. And although tablets have improved display capabilities, the large number of dedicated readers, these are the e-ink devices like the Kindle, work best when books are laid out using sans serif fonts and Ingres leading. Finally, in this category, publishers who see a market for enhanced ebooks or apps will want to try and leverage the capabilities of the platforms they run on. The cost and complexity of these offerings put them out of the reach of many publishers, unless the cost of an initial offering can be amortized across many titles, meaning that if you have, for example, a directory app that with some relatively small effort, you can adapt it for subsequent years or across subsequent similar titles. In terms of going global, 4 different things came to mind. The first is that larger Canadian publishers really can develop and implement systems to sell directly to ebook consumers around the world, but they're going to have to manage distribution across a widening range of devices. To maintain a digital presence and avoid downstream complexity, larger publishers can consider white label partnerships with aggregators like Kobo and in library space Overdrive. To better manage costs, smaller Canadian publishers with global ambitions should consider aggregators, things like vendors like Kobo and Amazon, as well as Google eBooks for distribution. If you're focused on a small set of markets that are of interest to you, you can choose between an aggregator doing business in that country and a local bookseller, an e-retailer with a local presence. This latter arrangement emulates the traditional model for rights sales, but it may also limit your broader global opportunity for some titles if you're doing it on a country-by-country basis. And then finally here, all publishers should look at maintaining worldwide rights for digital content and reacquiring rights to backlist titles that are no longer selling in print form in export markets. Although many backlist titles will still need to be converted to a digital form, the cost can generally be offset by a relatively modest number of units sold. In terms of internal assessments, and this might be of interest for, especially if you're just coming to this topic, as some of the registrants for today's webinar indicated they were, 5 different recommendations. First is digital content is likely to open up new business models, including subscription services and selling content as components or chunks. These aren't necessarily things that happen today or tomorrow, but they could happen down the road, and getting ready for them and becoming more familiar with the options is important. And they may lead to the development of topic-specific vertical niches like Safari Online, the O'Reilly product. And you should review your full list with these new business models in mind. Second, you're facing generally a business where the average price paid is likely to decline over time. So you really need to address what might be either lower margins or greater revenue at a lower price with efforts to contain costs and sell more digital units. The likely solutions for publishers will require the adoption of agile content, not necessarily XML, but it's a version of it. But agile content workflows with greater attention paid to tagging content in ways that support discovery and access, as well as potentially recombinant use. I mentioned at the outset that I had a one counterintuitive recommendation, and this is it. Publishers looking to expand beyond traditional export markets this would be the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, can look to data on where their titles are being most frequently pirated. The global visibility of digital content increases awareness in markets where a title is not yet available. Growth in unauthorized access can be a sign that a market has potential for legitimate sales. This is something that authors like Paulo Coelho have done quite frequently in markets like Russia, which generally is not known for paid sales, but seeing significant demand, came out with his own version and has been quite successful in doing so. Fourth, you want to keep up with trends and efforts related to reforming policy in place with respect to VAT assessments on digital books. They're currently generally assessed at double or more the rate for print books. And you should decide either individually or through member organizations where supporting or opposing efforts make sense for the availability and profitability of your titles. And then finally, the one that I mentioned that's sometimes overlooked, buy a reader and use it to read your own ebooks, as well as other publishers' titles. In the United States recently, Aptara, a conversion vendor in this space, indicated that a third of the 37% actually, of publishers responding had not actually read an ebook. And because digital books are forcing shifts in the overall value chain, the old rules do not reliably apply. You need to gain direct experience with new formats and devices. E-reading across a variety of platforms can provide publishers with a current and, I think, clear perspective on what's working, what's not working, and where you can focus on your management and promotion of ebooks. Now, I wanted to go back just before we wrap up and take questions, say that I wanted to put all the digital penetration charts on a common axis. Here you see the US and the UK, the two different sources of data, one from Barclays, one from PwC, plotted between 2010 and 2015. And you can see that even in the more modest scenario, the U.S. continues to lead the U.K. Through to at least the mid-2000s, 2010s. But on the same chart, same axis rather, you can see the significantly smaller markets that we expect for France, Spain, Germany, and the Netherlands. There's no rocket science to these numbers. Everybody's guessing at this point, and lots of things could happen between now and 2015. But the core thing is this, that there's a big market in the U.S., a growing and significant market in the U.K., and a question about how quickly and effectively other markets in Europe and elsewhere will grow. And it's worth keeping in touch with both the folks that you normally do business with in those countries, but as well as the international aggregators, to get a current snapshot, or as current a snapshot as you can, of what markets that are of interest to you. Finally, there are a variety of different resources. Nicolas mentioned at the beginning the Libre Canada Exporting Digital Books, a guide to best practices. I think as a result of this, if you've signed up for this webinar, actually you will be given a copy of that. I'm biased because I wrote it, but I think it's a good summary and shows in greater depth many of the topics that we've covered today. The other things that are listed here, the Barclays and Outsell and PwC reports, are available and effective. They're generally specific to either a market or a publisher or a particular topic, with the exception, I think, of the PwC, which is a little bit more broad, and certainly worth taking a look at. If you look at the full report from Libre Canada Books, there's a bibliography that is very detailed and very much worth sorting through if you need additional information on this topic. And I'm always happy to answer questions both now and of course, by email after this webinar is over.